Good morning. My name is Sonia Gospodinova, and I work in the European Commission department, which is in charge of the EU procurement legislation and also its external aspects. I'm also a member of the European Commission team, which negotiates within the WTO agreement on government procurement on behalf of the European Union. I have also worked in the accession process of Ukraine to the WTO. I'm very glad to be here and to participate in this workshop because the accession of Ukraine in itself is a major achievement. But however, it could become only meaningful once the Ukrainian companies can effectively reap the benefit of the opening of the procurement markets. The European procurement market consists of only one single market, and it covers all 28 member states. The value of the procurement market, which is covered by the European directives, is 423 billion euro for 2013, and the total size of the market is estimated to be 2.42 trillion. The part of the GDP of the European Union which is spent on procurement is around 14%, and this doesn't comprise the utilities procurement. The European procurement market is governed by two core principles. The first one is the principle of non-discrimination, and the second one, the principle of transparency. Also, the European procurement market is covered by a harmonized legislative framework which is applicable above certain thresholds. I would like to present also the structure of the European procurement market. First, we have the central government entities, which are included under Annex 1, and these include the entities of the European Union and also of the member states. The second level of the European market are the regional and local entities, also bodies governed by public law, such as hospitals, universities, schools, and these are included under Annex 2 of the European Union. Annex 3 of the European Union includes public undertakings in the utilities sector. Also, we cover under the European procurement market all goods, with the exception of the defense procurement, which is covered under a specific legislation. The European procurement market covers also all goods, all services, which make the major part of the procurement market. Under the GPA, we cover only a certain type of services, which is a positive list. The thresholds which are applied under the GPA for Annex 1, the central government entities for goods and services are 130,000 special drawing rights, which corresponds to 134,000 euros. And for construction services, this is 5 million SDR, corresponding to 5,186,000 euro. In Annex 2, the thresholds are 200,000 SDRs for goods and services and 5 million for construction services. And the Annex 3, which are entities operating in the utility sector, the thresholds are a bit higher, which are 400,000 for goods and services and 5 million for construction services. The European procurement market is covered by legislation, harmonized legislation, as I have already mentioned, and these are directives. What does it mean? The European directives set the framework for the European legislation. These are basic principles and procedures which have to be transposed into the member state, because each member state has a different national system and administration, so they need to adapt the basic rules to their own system. Currently, we have three types of legislation or three directives which are applicable. The first one is a directive which is applicable in the classical sector, and we have currently two pieces of legislation because recently we have conducted a reform. So the new piece of legislation is going to be applicable as from April this year. And this is Directive 2014-24 EC. The second piece of legislation is the procurement directive, which is applicable to entities operating in the utilities sector. And this is Directive 2014-25 EC. Then it is a novelty that we have now, following the reform, a directive which is covering contracts in the concession field. This is Directive 2014-23 EC. So, what are the type of entities which are covered by this different type of legislation? The scope of the covered entities for the two pieces of legislation are different. In the classical sector, the entities which have to apply the rules are the central government entities, and including regional also and local entities. Also bodies governed by public law, which are legal entities which are established for the pursuit of public interests, but they don't need to have commercial or industrial character. Also, the associations of these entities are covered under the directive. The second piece of legislation has a bit broader scope. We cover the same type of entities which are on the classical sector, meaning central, local, and regional, also bodies governed by public law, but which are operating in the utility sector. The additional scope which is distinct to this directive are the public undertakings, which correspond to the state-owned enterprises in Ukraine, and also we cover private companies which are operating in a monopolistic environment, meaning they have exclusive or special right, and operating in the utility sector. I would like to explain now to you the general features of the tendering procedures in the European Union. So the first step of the tendering procedure is the publication. The publication for each tendered contract which is above the thresholds for to be publication and publicize the contract to be tendered. The contract notice is usually published in the official journal of the European Union, but it is also always published in the Tender Electronic Daily, which is the database for electronic procurement in the European Union. And all of these contract notices follow a standard form, which is uniform for the whole European Union. And this is something which facilitates the job of the contracting authorities, which have always to follow a certain form, and they need to always publish the same type of information. So, as I mentioned, the Tenders Electronic Daily, it's an online database which includes all the currently published tender notices. This is a database for which one company should register, but this registration is very easy to pursue and to conduct. Currently, there are around 80,000 registered users. And on a daily basis, there are around 1,500 notices which are added to the database. All these notices are published in the 24 official languages, but according to the GPA obligation, we have also to provide a summary in English for each contract notice. And the use of the TET's Electronic Daily, it's free of charge both for the contracting entities and for the registered companies which would like to have access. Here are some facts about the published information. We have found out that for the supplies it's around 43% of the published notices. Then the services cover around 40% and the works around 7%. And this is median value. So here I give an example how the Tenders Electronic Daily look. You can, if you register, which is quite simple, then you have the option to look either according to the country or to the business opportunities. Then you have also above a search option. For example, you can type a place in the European Union, Porto. Once you have typed this, then you could go to a more refined search option where you could put either the type of contract that you're looking for or the contracting authority which is tendering the contract, or which helpful is the CPV code. The CPV codes are codes which indicate the type of service which is standard. And under the GPA, we use the CPC codes based on the UN nomenclature. In the European Union, this corresponds to the CPV codes, which are the same, let's say, type of services, but only under different code. So when you type, for example, Porto, then afterwards you could see all the current contracts which are published for Porto on the day of search. Here you can find more information about the tenders electronic daily and the electronic procurement system in the European Union. The second stage of the procurement procedure in the European Union is the selection of suppliers. What does this mean? That means that the contracting authority has to evaluate the technical and professional ability of the suppliers and also their financial standing. And this is done on the basis of certain criteria, which have to be objective, non-discriminatory, and also always to have link with the subject matter of the contract. Normally, these criteria have to be as well published and transparent, and they are either published in the contract notice or in the tender documentation, depending on the procedure which is applied. In the European Union, we have different types of procedures, but then here I will mention the main one. The first one, which is the most used procedure, is the open procedure. The second one is the restricted procedure, which corresponds to the selective tendering under the GPA. And this procedure has two stages. The first stage is where the supplier is applying and provides the information that the suppliers fulfill the qualification criteria. But only those suppliers which fulfill indeed the qualification and selection criteria will be invited for the second stage of the procedure and to file in a tender. And the reason for this is that in certain very complex contracts, it saves the burden for the tenderers to submit the tender, which can be quite voluminous already at the outset. And the third type of procedure, which is rather exceptional, is the negotiated procedure with or without publication, which corresponds to the limited tendering under the GPA. Also, the technical specifications which are applied in the European Union have to follow two principles. The first principle is the principle of transparency and openness, meaning that the technical specifications have to be drafted in a way as to allow access to everybody to the tender. And the second principle is the principle of equal treatment and non-discrimination, which shouldn't allow for any discrimination of tenderers on different principles, either nationality or origin of the goods, for example. As I have already mentioned, in the European Union we have recently conducted a reform, and there are some main changes which were introduced with this reform. This is the reduction of administrative burden. The reform provides for more flexibility, for better participation of small and medium-sized enterprises, for modernized award criteria, for strategic consideration, the use of, for example, environmental and social consideration. And also this reform is fully compliant with the GPA agreement. So concretely speaking, what does this mean for the companies participating in the tenders? So for the reduction of administrative burden, for example, we have conceived the single European procurement document, which allows, let's say, for the contracting authority to use one single document in which they indicate what is the information they need in order to assess the selection criteria imposed by them. So the companies then can only fill in this information without submitting any certificate proving the criteria. And then only the winning bidder is going to be expected to submit the certificates proving the fulfillment of the selection criteria. And also we have made the use of electronic procurement mandatory. As already mentioned, following the reform, we have now a novel piece of legislation which covers concession contracts. The new directive covers both the works concessions and also the services concessions above certain threshold, which is 5,186,000 euro. And it covers both the contracting authorities under the meaning of the classical sector, but also the contracting entities, which are usually covered by the piece of legislation applying to utilities procurement. Because it's a very novel piece of legislation and the procurement market for concessions was very fragmented in the European Union, even some member states didn't have any legislation on concessions, we have imposed with this first piece of legislation on concessions very basic rules, meaning there is the obligation to publish a contract concession notice and also a concession award notice after the concession contract was awarded. There are also some obligations concerning the electronic notification of the documents, meaning electronic procurement is also mandatory, but there is a lot of flexibility regarding the procedures to be conducted. Each member state can decide on what type of procedures they are going to apply for concession contracts. And of course, they can also use certain qualification criteria, exclusion grounds, but also award criteria which have to be objective and non-discriminatory. As maybe you're aware, the European Union and Ukraine have concluded an association agreement which includes also a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. This agreement has entered into force on the 1st of January 2016. And actually, this agreement provides Ukraine a status which is as close as possible to a member state status. And it provides also an unprecedented access to the procurement market, but also to the market of the European Union. The DCFTA includes a chapter on procurement, which has to follow the implementation of 5 phases. The first phase is just to mention the bigger framework, that the purpose of the chapter is to implement certain institutional reforms, also to approximate the Ukrainian legislation to the European directives, and to provide for gradual access to the respective markets. The first phase, in order to fulfill these aims, has focused on the establishment of institutional framework, on basic standards and a roadmap. This has an indicative timeline of 6 months. If this is fulfilled, then the Ukrainian companies will get access to the procurement of central government entities for supplies. The second phase of this agreement is the one that has to fulfill certain basic, approximate certain basic elements of the classical directive and the remedies directive on the classical sector, and the timeline is 3 years. If this is fulfilled, then the Ukrainian companies will receive access to the state, regional, and local entities procurement for supplies. The third phase has to be fulfilled by the 4th year after the implementation, and it includes the approximation of basic elements of the Utilities Directive and the Remedies Directive applicable in the utilities sector. Then the Ukrainian companies will get access to all contracting authorities' procurement for supplies again. The 4th phase has to be pursued until the 6th year of the implementation, and it includes the implementation of certain other elements of the classical directive and the concession directive, as I mentioned. This would allow access to the procurement market of all contracting authorities, but including also services and works and services concessions. The final stage of the implementation is the 5th phase, which should be accomplished by the 8th year of the implementation, and it includes the approximation of the Ukrainian legislation to other elements of the Utilities Directive, and then the companies will get access to all contracting entities procurement for works and services, including the utility sector. So here I have given some examples for this basic and additional elements. Maybe just to explain with few words the interrelation between the access to the European procurement market between the GPA and the DCFTA. So once the Ukraine has ratified the GPA and the GPA has entered into force for Ukraine, the Ukrainian companies will have immediate access to all the committed procurement of the EU under the GPA. And the DCFTA, this process is rather gradual and is linked to the conduction of certain reforms and approximation of legislation. But at the end of the day, when the period of 8 years has elapsed, then the Ukrainian companies will have access to the complete European market for procurement, meaning to all services and not only to the positive list of services which is included in the GPA, also very importantly to all utilities, because currently the European Union covers only public undertakings under the GPA and not the private companies which are with exclusive and special right and which operate in the utility sector. And also very major procurement are the concession contracts for works also and for services, for which the Ukrainian companies will have access once the DCFTA is accomplished. Thank you very much. I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Sonia. The EU market is probably the most interesting for our exporters, and I strongly encourage you to register on TED's website. It takes about 2 minutes. It's very straightforward, and have a look around. I'm sure you will find something that you will want to sell. Are there any questions?
Can I have just
Yeah, sure.
I have a question, if you don't mind.
Sorry.
Volodymyr from Zaporizhia Chamber of Commerce and Industry. So my question is about the statistics. The previous speaker has shown us the page with the of WTO, where I can find the statistic for different countries. For Europe, the statistic is available just for the 2010, not for 11, 12, and all the years where we can find it. And the second question, you have mentioned several portals, several sites where we can find the information about the current tenders. What is the difference between them? You have shown 2 slides with the year, Europe, and the second slide shows us some other sites, and you also say that this is the official site where you can find the information about the current tenders. What is the difference?
So just on the first question regarding the statistics, so far the European Union has submitted the statistical reports until 2011. I'm not sure if they're also published on the WTO website, because normally it takes a bit longer from the time of submission until they're put available on the websites, but normally we have submitted until 2011. And then we are currently working on the subsequent years, which will be 2012 and 13, and then as from 2014, because then the revised GPA has entered into force, which provides for certain flexibilities also regarding the electronic procurement. Then the revised GPA, for example, provides for the opportunity that the GPA parties put available on the also WTO website the link to the electronic procurement website of the party, where all the necessary information can be found. And also in the European Union, everything is put available on the tenders electronic daily. So the information that you're looking, you can find. You can, for example, create your own statistic depending on the values that are going to type in. Then on the second question, which is concerning the website, there is only one website. I don't know if there was a confusion, but I will go back just to the presentation to show to you. This is the tenders electronic daily. So basically, this is the website, the only website which is available, let's say, at European Union level, on which you can find all the tenders which are published within the EU. It's only this website, Tenders Electronic Daily. I just tried to simulate how it would look like if you type a search word. For example, here above you can find search, the search option. And if you put, for example, place, you can put also a services contract, you can put also a country. Then you would come on the same website, you would come to this refined search tool. And if you can see above, it's the Tenders Electronic Daily still. So it's only this website. So then, for example, again for the place Porto, then we go to this research result, which lists all the procurement contracts which are published on the day of the search in Porto. And then if I go back, for example, you can put the contract entities, you can put the country, you can search according to different keywords. But there is only one website, which is the Tenders Electronic Daily. And then here I'm providing links, pardon? There is an information which is giving best practices, for example, for electronic procurement, different type of information which can be helpful, also related to the member states, because this is the unified platform for the whole European Union, but then each member state or each contracting authority can have their own website. So this is just information website which can give you further details for the electronic procurement which is applied in the European Union. And then there is also this PEPL project, which goes beyond the European Union member state. It includes further member states which can be part of this network and also exchange different best practices and give more information about the respective procurement practices which are applied and used. Yeah.
Thank you. At the back.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to ask you is it envisaged by the directives, EU directives of public procurement and GPA as well, to differentiate rules applied under the thresholds and over the thresholds? I mean the rules, if it envisaged to be rules under the thresholds referred to as national rules, and over the thresholds referred to as international rules. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. As already mentioned in my presentation, the European directives are a framework legislation, meaning they're stipulating the basic principles and procedures which have to be transposed in each member state, because we want to create and we have one single procurement market. That's why we have to make sure that the same procedures are applied in Germany, in Spain, in Portugal, in Sweden, in Bulgaria. So that's why in these directives we are putting some basic procedures and principles to be transposed in each procurement system of every member state. Meaning that means actually that the national procurement legislation of the member states, it's more detailed because they have to provide for further information for the suppliers. And that doesn't, we think, let's say, that above the threshold that we have applied for the different layers of the government, that these are the contracts which are of cross-border interest, meaning smaller contracts are not of interest for the companies of another member state, because it involves certain burden to go and to bid to another member state. So that's why, in order to have a fair balance, we have provided for these thresholds. But in the respective member states, the legislation, usually we have found out, the legislation and the procurement rules, they apply also below the threshold. But this we have left to the discretion of each member state. So most probably that these contracts which are below the thresholds, they are still covered by the procurement rules, also by the procurement procedures, depending on the individual member state. And then also what I have mentioned regarding the tenders electronic daily, that normally above the thresholds, all contracts have to be published. So there is an obligation for transparency. But this doesn't exclude that contracting authorities can publish on the same website also notices covering procurement below the thresholds. So they can do it as well, free of charge, but this is done on the discretion of the contracting authority. Because if, for example, in a concrete case, if the contracting authorities a municipality looks for a special type of service and they know, for example, that in their country it is less probable to receive it, then they can decide to publish it at European level.
Вы говорили про график интеграции Украины, и через полгода будет достигнут один уровень, а через 3 года другой, более глубокий уровень. У меня практический вопрос. Наша компания занимается разработкой веб-сайтов. Скажите, пожалуйста, мы должны какой-то период подождать, или мы уже можем участвовать в тендерах европейских и выигрывать? Спасибо.
Yeah, because there are different phases of our entry. Do we need to wait, or can we already participate in tenders? Can you repeat that question one more time?
Yes.
Еще раз можно? Вопрос, пожалуйста.
Вы говорили про график интеграции Украины, и через полгода будет достигнут определенный уровень интеграции, а через 3 года более глубокий уровень. У меня практический вопрос. Наша компания занимается разработкой веб-сайтов. Мы можем прямо сейчас участвовать в тендерах и выигрывать их? Спасибо.
So my last point of the presentation was regarding the rights which are provided under the GPA and also under the DCFTA. So practically speaking, for services and goods which are covered under the GPA, you will have access immediately after the entry into force of the GPA for Ukraine. I mean, the Deputy Minister has explained that this should happen in the very near future. Yes, this month. So basically, as from the next month, because you have to deposit, Ukraine has to deposit its instrument of accession, 30 days following this deposit, then you effectively can have the right to bid in the European Union procurement market. But this is only limited to the goods and services which are stipulated under the GPA. So you have to look at the Annex 5 of the European Union, which stipulates exactly the services which are provided. And there are also some consultancy services, some computer services. So most probably you will be able already to bid from next month. But for services, for example, which are not covered on the GPA, you will have to wait until the gradual steps according to the DCFTA are put in place. Does this reply to your question?
So before we begin our next 2 presentations, I wanted to just give the floor for a moment back to Sonia from the Commission, because she's realizing during the coffee break that she had several repeat questions and she wanted to clarify an important part of her presentation to help everyone's understanding. So please, Sonia.
Thank you. I wanted just to repeat once again the difference for the access between the GPA and the DCFTA. So the thresholds for the access to the European Union procurement market will be the same. For central government entities, it is 130,000 SDRs. For the sub-central, it is 200,000 SDRs, and for the works, it is 5 million SDRs. So the thresholds under both agreements will be the same. The difference is the scope of the opening of the procurement markets, meaning, for example, that under the GPA, the European Union has a positive list of services. There is only a number of services to which the GPA parties companies have access. Under the DCFTA, the Ukrainian companies will have access to all services as they are covered under the European Union legislation. Also, following the implementation of the DCFTA, the Ukrainian companies will have access to the procurement of the private companies with exclusive and special rights operating in the utility sector, which are currently not covered in the GPA, and Ukrainian companies will have also access to the works and services concession contracts which are conducted by the entities of the European Union once the DCFTA was applied. So basically the difference would be not in the thresholds, but it will be in the scope of the opening of the procurement. Under the DCFTA, it will be access to the whole European Union procurement market. And then also maybe a final remark on the thresholds. So above the mentioned thresholds, there will be a legally secured access for Ukrainian companies. But that doesn't mean that a Ukrainian company cannot participate in a procurement procedure also below the thresholds. They could do so, but then they would not have a legally secured access to this tender. But still, they could try. And for example, if they have the best tender, they're the most competitive, then there is a chance and possibility that the procuring entity will accept their tender. Thank you.